Hello, and welcome to this US 275 Scientific Ethics Lecture, where we're going to take a look at gender and ethics. So to start out with taking a look at gender and ethics, kind of put this in a little bit of a historical perspective, so that today, in the basically the 2020s, in theory, women have the same fundamental rights as men, but as recently as 1960s and 1970s, this was not so. And even though they have the same fundamental rights, we've still got to make some good progress and got some distance to go in actually having true equality in what we're looking at. Traditionally, and again from a historical perspective, we see that in most societies, men are going to be making the moral rules, and because of that, because of the patriarchal society, patriarchal governments, the female perspective on moral issues has often been ignored in favor of the male perspective. And so in many cases, the moral codes that we've looked at up to this point have had a decidedly male influence as we look at them. Now, Alison Jaggar came up with a series of theories, but basically 5 harms that are associated with the male bias within ethical system. The first is that it relegates women to subservient obligations. This idea that the men would be out in the workplace and making the important decisions, and the women would be at home and in a kind of obedient, subservient role. And so the women's obligations in this would then be kind of obedience, silence, faithfulness. And again, you can see this in a lot of ways throughout history until more modern times. Another harm of the male bias is that it confines women to really socially isolated roles. So in the home, as opposed to in the workplace, isolated with the children, as opposed to going out and interacting with society. Another harm is that it has a tendency to deny the moral agency of women, often to the point of claiming that they lack the capacity or lack the ability for doing moral reasoning, to make determinations about what is right and wrong. As we're going to see throughout today, at least in this portion of the lecture, is that these male bias and ethics are often, because we take a look at this as the ethical systems are built by the society based on the perspective that they have. The male bias was going to emphasize male values over female ones. And so the male values, if you want to think about it, tend to be more of independence, more of autonomy, and this is a way of describing it, so don't take offense at what I'm saying, but more of kind of an intellectual problem-solving approach to their interactions, as is a tendency of male approaches. The female approach tends to be one of interdependence, building strong community, strong connections, sharing, and again, kind of a more emotional approach. And again, I realize that this is oversimplifying it. It's making some broad generalizations that aren't true in all cases, but they are a tendency, and at least from Jaggar's perspective, this is what she's reporting. The last of the 5 harms of the male bias in ethics is that these male notions of moral rules, judgments about particular actions, these impartial moral assessments and contractual agreements are all taken a look at from the male perspective, and often from a more rigid, rule-oriented approach, as opposed to more of a collaborative kind of community type approach to this. So if we're taking a look at gender and ethics, what we have are 2 relatively key questions that we need to consider. How do men and women psychologically differ from one another? We can take a look at people, and we can see that physiologically, the ways the bodies are, and the way that the bodies work are going to be different. But is there truly a psychological or kind of a mind difference between men and women? And so is there that? And then based on these psychological differences, how do men and women morally differ from one another? And again, if at all. And how we've answered these questions in history have really determined at various times within the history of humanity whether or not women have been empowered and given a seat at the table, given kind of broader kind of roles within society, or have they been subjugated and kept down, basically in a presence where they're with the home, they're with the children, instead of interacting out in society. And so if we take a look at this again from a historical perspective, and don't kill the messenger here, but taking a look at some of the classical views of gender and morality, beginning as early as ancient Greece and moving to more modern times, what we can see is kind of very dramatic changes in the view of women and morality. Going back to Aristotle, the view was more of women and natural subservience, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about each one of these as we go through. But the role is the women as being subservient to the man. The wife, is there to serve the husband in essence. Rousseau, more recently, takes a look at women as objects of sexual desire. Again, not recognizing them as being fully capable of having moral capacities, the ability to make moral decisions on their own. Wollstonecraft is advocating for a more general neutral morality. And then finally, we'll take a look at the most recent, or at least a recent version of looking at this, where we look at instinct and social construction. And so the role, or at least the view of Aristotle, one of women and their natural subservient role, again, keep in mind, set up, millennia ago, thousands of years ago, but, still as seen in this 1950s, maybe early 60s advertisement here, still pervasive within society, even to more modern times. This view of the natural subservient is that men are designed to command and women were to obey. And the reason for that, and Aristotle and philosophers of his time argued that there were different capacities of the soul, different capacities of, if you want to think about it, almost a cognitive ability or ability to think about these moral concepts and moral ideas. So slaves in that society were seen to have no deliberative faculty. So they basically, they were slaves. They had to be told everything that they had to be done. They had to be controlled because they had no ability to really think on their own and make moral decisions on their own. Women were viewed as having deliberative faculty, but without authority. And so, they had, potentially the ability to make decisions, but they couldn't act on those decisions. And therefore they weren't able to exercise, their moral views as they were interacting with other people. Children at this period of time were seen to, or at least thought to have, kind of an immature deliberative faculty. And so the idea with children is that you would be kind of developing those characteristics. And again, to take a look at this from the historical perspective and the patriarchal approach, male children, boys, were building these deliberative skills. Female girls, female children, girls were looked at as kind of developing into the woman, so that you can have those thoughts, but you didn't have the authority to act on them. And then ultimately, again, from Aristotle's and his collaborators, colleagues, and all that, the men are viewed as having the deliberative faculty with the authority to act on it. And so they can make these important moral decisions, and they have the ability to, act upon it in their actions with one another. And so if we take a look at this, again, extending on this view of women and their natural subservience, Aristotle's response to moral questions is that all of us have a range of virtues which are going to be present, but the men's virtues are tied more towards commanding, leadership, and women's virtues are tied to obeying and following. And therefore, this is viewed as a distinct female morality, which is distinctly different from the male's morality and the male's authority to act. And so basically an example of this is shown in the divine order over here. Not exactly what we're talking about in terms of the subservient, but this idea of kind of overlying the religious, the God, giving kind of overall authority, overall protection. The husband kind of as that intermediate, that kind of authority figure on earth and in the home. And then the wife, again, subservient, kind of underneath the husband and underneath the God, having really an authoritarian role only in kind of the raising of children. And again, this is a very patriarchal approach to doing it, and a very kind of historical approach. Rousseau kind of modified that and said, women, we shouldn't have to, make them think about having to make moral decisions, because really what they are is objects of sexual desire. And so we've got another, I think this is 1940s, maybe early 1950s advertisement here. Again, incredibly sexist. Hopefully wouldn't be able to get away with this in advertisement today. But it kind of shows, historically, the views and how the views have changed in a relatively short period of time. Okay, so Rousseau's argument was in a response to, what are the differences between male and female morality. It basically said that men are strong and aggressive. They have that psychological kind of mindset. Women are weak and passive. And again, massive oversimplification, but this is what he was putting forth in his theories. And so women are weak and passive. Women are designed to sexually please their men, where men, it's their strength that attracts the woman to the man, and it's her beauty that attracts the man to the woman. So again, looking at women in kind of a subservient role, but a slightly different role than what Aristotle was talking about. Extending on this, Rousseau's argument was that in response to the moral question, is that women should, embrace their sexuality, learn how to kind of please their man, entice their man, satisfy his desires, and that basically once a woman does that, she's able to get what she wants, the support and the protection that she needs from the stronger, more aggressive male. And therefore, what Rousseau argues is that we should recognize the differences between men and women, but women need to be educated differently. What women need to be doing is learning how to use their beauty, use their kind of characteristics, womanly characteristics, to bring out their natural differences, to attract a man and have the man kind of protect and not really control, but have authority over her. Wollstonecraft, in the late 1700s, about the time of the American Revolution, she was an English writer and philosopher, but one of the first really recognized advocates of women's rights. And she basically said, in response to the psychological question, are the brains, the ways of thinking of men and women fundamentally different? She said that there are differences, but the differences and the general roles that go along with them are really not biological, but they're imposed on them and the education. And so basically, society is subjugating women in the way that they're treated, in the way that they're educated, in their expectations, and therefore women, at least in this period of time, really have no choice in the matter, because they're basically being set up to develop in this way, and again, in that subservient role, in almost a mold built within this patriarchal society. Her argument was to develop more of a general neutral morality, general neutrality, with the recognition that men and women are fundamentally different, But they do have the ability to reason. They do have the ability to exercise virtue, and they do have the passion for knowledge. And it's these three characteristics then that separate them from the animals. And so because of this, what Wollstonecraft was advocating is that as members of humanity, all individuals, male and female, have duties and obligations to act morally in their actions with one another. And there's no special female virtues or female obligations. And so, they may be good at child rearing, they may be, sexually alluring, but that isn't in and of itself just the sole definition of what femininity is and what these female virtues and characteristics are. This led rise into this idea that there are differences between instinct, which are kind of the kind of inbred biological characteristics and traits that we talked about a little bit with the biology and ethics lecture earlier today, versus social construction. Social construction is this idea that society kind of imprints its thoughts on individuals based on how they're expected to act. And so an example of this are kind of toys over here from children. And so you've got a little play set over here. The pink one, presumably for little girls, is a beauty studio. And so you open it up, and I can't really see what's going on, but it looks like a little mirror and maybe some makeup and some brushes and things like that. And in contrast, you've got a blue one over here, kind of designed, blue for boys, because, that's what society, that's society construction, pink for girls, blue for boys. The blue one over here is my first carry-along medical center. And so the idea is that, women are going to focus on their beauty, men are going to focus on, or at least little boys are going to focus on becoming doctors. And so because of this, again, this is taking that social construction view. What's interesting is there have been studies in rhesus monkeys that boys, at least male monkeys, preferred wheeled toys over dolls and girls. But there was no significant preference. And so there's no kind of innate biological drive that says boys have to, play with construction vehicles and girls have to play with dolls. So again, that's more towards the social construction, the societal values that are kind of imprinting on the individuals that are growing up within that society. So there are some psychological gender differences that are ingrained in men and women. But the question is, are those instinctive? Are those differences a result of biology, or are they merely social constructions? Is it the fact that society is, conveying those expectations to little girls, and so they're hearing all the time that, you want to grow up, you want to, get married and have a family and, have a house. And so because of that, it makes it more challenging for a girl to break out of that mold. Have to be much more stronger willed to be able to break through those kind of barriers put in by society in order to be able to kind of go outside of those kind of societal expectations and pursue other things. And so some of those then need to be recognized, and especially when we're taking a look at social construction and the ideas associated with it, really think about the impact that they're having, especially on children as they're developing, because it's going to have a role on adults as they've developed and kind of learned their experiences, learned their perspective as children. So if we take a look at this, we can take a look at what are described as female care ethics. There may be a preference, or at least a slight preference, not psychological preference, for males to focus on wheeled toys, take a look at construction vehicles, things like that. And again, that's kind of related to kind of that perspective that the males are going to be in kind of a rule-governed kind of approach, where females may have a tendency, probably not significantly different, but may have a preference or tendency to play with dolls, to interact with the dolls, because there's a female tendency to see the world more in social and relationship roles, as opposed to the more rule-governed model of the male approach. And so female care ethics is this idea that a morality that arises from the female perspective is going to be focused more on the needs of others, focused more on the building of community and the interactions and the relationships, while the male perspective, and again from a historical perspective as well, the patriarchal societies and the male perspectives have been more focused on, creating rules, enforcing those rules, and establishing moral duties. So if we take a look at this, again, different variations of this, we can take a look at Kohlberg's theory, which takes a look at stages of moral development, which move from kind of selfishness and ego to kind of impartial justice. Criticisms of Kohlberg basically say that his studies used only males, and therefore his justice view of morality is male-oriented. And so this idea that you develop from focused on the self to kind of focused on kind of individuals and their interaction with one another, and showing impartial justice is developmental stages that an individual is going to be going through. Gilligan had a theory that the women's moral point of view is different from the men's, and again similar to the idea that men emphasize the rights and the justice principles, where women are going to be involved with focusing in more on kind of the process and focusing more on those interpersonal relationships and the community. And therefore, what we're seeing in society, again, because of the way that we've taken this approach, is that girls are going to go from focusing too much on their own interests as a child to focusing too much on other interests, the needs of her children, the needs of her husband, as opposed to balancing her needs and other needs at some point in the middle. So if we take a look at the themes that are around and found within the ethics of care, we see that women, at least in this theory, have a lot of their personal identity, in many cases their self-worth, deeply connected, deeply interconnected with their relationships with other people. And therefore, because that is a mindset that is kind of instilled in women as, kind of societal expectations, women are going to tend to, look at moral situations, again, based on their perspective and based on their experiences, and based on the expectations of society in many ways. So women are going to see this morality in the context of these close personal relationships. And so it's been described then that women see morality as a function of vulnerability and dependency to interact and help others, and hopefully that others would be helping them as well. And so if we take a look at this and expand into particularism, moral particularism is this idea that when we have these moral interactions, when we have these decisions made about the actions with one another, we need to focus in on distinct particular reactions or relations with people, not on kind of abstract theories about how they should be acting or how they may be acting at some point in the future. And so it's recognized, this concept of particularism and moral particularism is the obligations that an individual will have within their family, the individual related to them within their close circle of friends, as well as their local community. And defenders of care ethics, again, taking a look at this from the female perspective, often make the argument that traditional morality has not gone far enough at particularizing our moral obligations. That even when we're taking a look at altruism and some of the other philosophical models that we've talked about within the course, we're still focused in more on rules and problem solving, and less on those interactions in a positive way with one another. Now neo-Notings within the 20th century basically said that these the female care moralities are an example of virtue theory, or component of virtue theory, where the care is going to be a nurturing character trait that we personally internalize and we express because it becomes part of our core. And so therefore care ethics then is a key and very important part of traditional women's behavior, as well as what would be found within a more female-directed moral system. Notings emphasizes that trying to come up with a truly gender-free morality may be impossible, because what we're looking at is a pretty dramatic shift between the way things have been done in the past, the way things are being done now, and potentially how they could be done within the future. And she went to the point of really emphasizing that what we have with our traditional male, if you want to put it that way, the traditional male or rule-governed morality is really at odds with this ethics of collaboration and compassion and care. And therefore, it's hard to bring those two things together. Sarah Clarke Miller, again, a relatively recent philosopher, is making an argument that care is compatible with more of the different general morality principles and the different theories, but it has to be used in the decision-making process. It's only one element that needs to be considered. So you can't have truly that care approach because you need to be involving other moral judgments as well in making these decisions. And so that female care value that we've been talking about throughout this thread can be expressed as both a duty and an obligation to care, but there may be other things that are impacting upon it. And so what we're taking a look at is that care value best expressed as a virtue, or is it seen as a duty, as an obligation? And there are ways in which we can kind of bring those two things together. And so the idea is that, like that development that we talked about a few slides ago, the development of this morality and the moral codes that go along with it is going to start out from kind of a duty of obligation, a duty to serve others, if in a way that's based on a general set of rules. But as we kind of internalize those rules, those duties then become virtuous habits that kind of represent the kind of ingrained nature of those duties. And so we develop the virtue of care in a way by caring for others and becoming caring people. And so you're basically building that habit of being a charitable individual focused on the well-being of others in a virtuous way. So if we take a look at this, and still an effort to try to come up with this kind of universal ethical theory, we have four options regarding gender and ethics. We can take the male-only approach, and that tends to be the historic approach. The female-only approach, which we talked a little bit about, and kind of some ideas associated with it. Separate but equal options, so having both a male ethics system and a female ethics system, or having a mutually inclusive option. And so kind of the best parts of the male and the best parts of the female systems coming together and giving us something that would guide our behavior going forward. So the male-only option, again, tends to be the traditional male view of ethics, again, from a patriarchal perspective, which tends to emphasize general abstract principles and how these rules then can be applied. This male-only approach argues that morality is general neutral and it can be applied universally to all people. The problem is, again, because it was made from a male perspective, it does not necessarily kind of have the same impact and role on other people's as well. And so the criticism of the male-only approach is that advances to both biology and psychology suggest that the male-only approach to ethics is incomplete. It doesn't give us all the answers that we need to be looking for. The female-only approach is this idea that we have a morality to all people to follow, but we need to focus on the care ethics, focus on our interactions with others, rather than this past system of rigid rule-based systems. Now, the criticism for this are, again, kind of like taking a look at two extremes when we've looked at within this course. A female-only option is also incomplete. There are a lot of other principles that are going to be an important part of a moral code and making decisions about kind of the ethics associated with the decision making, the appropriateness of a behavior that you may be looking at. The separate but equal approach kind of takes a look at this idea that we can have two equally valid domains. We can have a male only and a female only kind of coming together, kind of grounded within those inherent gender differences. And again, not identifying whether it's inherently because of biology or inherently because of social constructive, but recognize then that we need to acknowledge the differences between individuals, that women in general prefer one-on-one relationships, which are critical for immediate survival, focused in on the needs of the family unit, where men have a general preference for larger groups. And so therefore, they're going to be involved with interacting and developing social systems and societies and the broader culture kind of outside of the home. And again, criticisms associated with this is that, we describe it as women only, we describe it as men only, but we've got individuals that, kind of cross over these societal expectations and these gender-based kind of descriptions of what we've got here. And so an effort to kind of create this, two kind of separate but equal systems in place, probably is going to end up with disastrous consequences for women because they're again excluded from those kind of outside of the household, greater societal interactions within the kind of the broader culture, the broader society that they're found within. And finally, we get to the theory of a mutually inclusive option. And so with this, A would be like the male approach, B would be like the female approach. The mutually inclusion option would be A and B, those portions that are in common within both of them. And so basically this kind of recognizes that we've got this kind of overlap, which is going to be present. And so women are going to be adopting portions of the male system. Men are going to have their system, but also adopting versions of the female approach as well. And if we take a look at this historically, this in many ways is what we've got, but it's incomplete. What we've got is a situation where women, again, from that historical perspective and societal values and the social construct that the society is dictating towards girls as they grow up to be women, have really forced the women into an area where they've had to internalize and recognize the male approach and adapt their approach to kind of move into it. The problem, though, is that in many cases, men have not adjusted their moral expectations to include more of the female values. And so we've got less of the care ethics, less of the focus in on community and interactions, and men still tend to have a tendency to focus in on that rule approach. Okay, so that finishes up this introduction to gender and ethics. So if you can take a look at chapter 11 within the textbook, we're finally getting to the end of the textbook. And we're going to be using this information in assignments and as we're thinking about the science, different examples of science as we go through the course. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you and have a great day.